Hey guys, welcome to the Lunge and Lift podcast. Today we have a great episode in store for you, all about strength ratios. We're going to run through what are strength ratios, why they exist, and what's the reality behind them. Do they actually matter, and should you be thinking about them at all? But before we get into it, as always, a big thank you to our show sponsors, thetrainingstimulus.com. If you'd like to learn more about movement mechanics, please check out the website for more information there. Wit-fitness.com. Use discount code LL15 to get 15% off your purchase. And Hydro, use discount code LL20 to get 20% off your blood flow restriction apparel. Right, let's get into it.
Yeah, mate. So strength ratios, what was interesting, when I saw your notes initially, I was like, strength ratios? He ain't about strength ratios. And I looked down in the notes, I was like, oh, there we go.
Don't give it away, mate.
I think the main thing is because even just from having a little bit of a chat to you prior to the episode, it just kind of did put some thoughts into my head. And it's funny because as a strength-based athlete, I've had strength ratios run through my head for most of my training career, say. Not that I matter too much about if I'm underperforming or anything like that, but I've always thought, okay, what is that in relation to my body weight? For someone that then lifts, like uses the barbell as my measure, I think it's been really nice. I hate it when people do use the body weight ratio when we're talking about pull-ups, because I swear that is bollocks. Because if I'm pulling up 100 kilos above that bar, I don't give a monkeys if I've got more muscle. It's a lot of weight going above that bar. So I've always disliked that ratio of the pull-up ratio. But that's, again, going to be hugely biased because I'm just shit at pull-ups.
Yeah. So I think it's just human nature, isn't it? Everyone likes what they're good at.
Yeah.
But I think we should start off with what are strength ratios. Yeah. So there's this notion in fitness and strength and conditioning that there is an ideal relationship in performance between given movements. So some common examples might be 3 to 4 to 5 bench to squat to dead. So what that means is it should be a 4 to 3 ratio from your back squat to your bench, and a 5 to 3 ratio from your deadlift to your bench, and a 5 to 4 ratio from your deadlift to your squat.
So to put some numbers on that, if it was 150 kilo bench press, you should have a 200 kilo squat and a 250 kilo deadlift. Just because I got a little bit confused about that for some reason, I couldn't work it out. But that's the ratio of what supposedly is the standards.
Yeah,
what you should have.
Yeah. Exactly, as a balanced athlete. So the notion there is that if you're a power lifter and your numbers aren't in those ratios, then that's the thing that you should be working on. So if your bench press was 140 and your squat was 200 and your dead was 250, then you need to bring up your bench. And likewise for the other two movements, if you're away from that ratio, that's kind of where your weakness lies. A similar thing, a lot of people talk about your front squat should be 85% of your back squat. Other ratios, similar to a ratio people will talk about in terms of programming volume, you should have 2 to 1 pull to push. And in weightlifting, people will talk about having your front squat be a certain percentage over your clean, or an overhead squat a certain percentage over your snatch. There's also ratios where people like to say your power should relate to your squat version with certain percentages as well.
Yeah, then do you know what I think when it comes to like these percentages, what that's basically saying is that you need to be a balanced athlete and that you cannot be a specialist in one particular field. So for instance, with the squat, bench and deadlift, you might be an absolute boss at squatting, but be a bit shit in the bench and be quite good in the deadlift. That's just how you're that's how you're made up. So that like you're playing to your strengths. So obviously you're trying to get your bench as good as possible. And that's where I think having too much of a stress on those ratios can obviously be quite a hindrance. So because I know like I guess when you get to a higher level in competing, you won't take notice of those ratios. You're going to be thinking, right, what am I doing to get stronger? How can I improve my weaknesses? And when you're saying weaknesses is because you think, do you know what? My bench press is lagging a bit than what I think it should be. Comparing it to the field that you're up against. So then you're using other people's numbers, even if you have some specialists in those fields. You say, right, to get myself a bit more competitive because of how good my squat is, I can try and bring my bench press up as well, rather than, and still obviously try and progressive overload the squat and the deadlift over the time, but I'm going to try and maybe increase my bench.
Yeah. So yeah, I think we're jumping ahead a little bit there.
Sorry, mate. Sorry, mate.
In terms of setting the scene, but you're spot on with so many of those points. I think to get a good understanding of strength ratios and sort of why they're around or why they exist, I think the notion of a well-rounded, balanced body is one, and there's also this idea that if you have those ratios, you avoid issues like quad dominance versus glute dominance or knee dominance versus hip dominance. You also can mitigate poor shoulder position, and it means if you pursue strength development in these ratios, you can avoid those sorts of imbalances or issues. And I just don't think that's true at all. I think that like you can have the perfect ratios and still have lots of dysfunction, and you can have really different ratios and have absolutely no issues whatsoever. And we were talking about this just before the recording, how you see loads of people who have amazing, incredibly strong deadlifts, but they're still quad dominant. They still use their quads and their lower back. They're just extremely strong there. So if that, by this logic, bringing up their squat number closer to their deadlift would be what they should be doing, but that's probably only going to exacerbate the quad dominance by doing even more squatting. So it's actually a technical matter if that is a problem. Like some people, like Rob said, are just stronger in different areas of their body. So for maximal performance, it might be better for them to have a more quaddy backy deadlift than somebody else who's really strong in their hips, where actually having a more glute dominant hinge pattern would produce bigger numbers. So I think the high level summary is are we focusing on the actual issue here? Like if it's a performance issue, then what's holding back performance? It's probably not the ratio between your bench, your squat, and your deadlift. It's probably something with the movement itself rather than that percentage.
I guess the ratios, though, kind of give people a bit of a baseline understanding of, cool, where should they probably fall between? Because I do feel, for instance, that if my, say, bench was 140 and my squat was 200 and my deadlift was 250, based on those ratios, it said that, cool, I need to bring my bench up. That might be a little bit of an indication that's saying, okay, cool, I should do some more benching. Not saying that the others two shouldn't increase, and they probably will, and I'll probably always have that poor ratio. But what it does, it kind of adds a numerical number, like it adds some numbers to something which is a thought, and you will probably disagree with that, and that's completely fine, because that's coming more from like a personal standing. Because if you're trying to be in powerlifting the strongest powerlifter, it's, as we discussed, it's about having the biggest total. So however you get there is however you get there. So then when we're say, if we're not at the top of the game and we're not winning and we're chasing that top first place, and we're saying, cool, I'm comparing my numbers to other people's, and I'm saying, what am I lagging compared to someone else, my body weight? So what is the ratios that look in there? So if my bench is underneath 6 other people in my category, it gives me an indication that maybe my bench could have an extra day's worth of work, and see if that can help bring my strength up. Because some people, like for instance, the person I competed with, Adam Madison, right? He's notoriously been shit at benching. He's always had a shit bench, but his squat and his deadlift are really good. He's extremely low body. And does that affect his training? Not really. He does know that his bench needs that little bit more attention and a little bit more work, because he's underperforming in his weight category in the bench press, but because he's hanging with the big dogs in the other numbers. So for me, that ratio, not necessarily, this I guess then kind of leads away necessarily from the exact ratio of 3 to 4 to 5, but in comparison to his squat and his deadlift, he needs a bigger bench because he's not competitive in his weight class because his bench is so poor.
I think you answered your own question earlier in your comments there, in that the thing you're optimizing for is the biggest total by whatever means possible. So if he could add 10 kilos to his total in his squat and his deadlift more easily, then that's a better use of his training time. So by like his body type might be so unfavorable for benching that he's actually very close to his potential maximum bench, whereas he might not be close to his maximum potential squats or deadlift. So in terms, it becomes a resource allocation question. Like, where does he spend his training time, effort, volume in the week? And to maximize for the biggest total, it might actually be better to play to his strengths than try to bring up his weakness. And this is why the ratios become confusing, because it's very situational
Yeah.
and individual dependent, depending on your body type, depending on your training history and sporting background, depending on what type of athlete you are in terms of like, do you tend towards hypermobile or hypomobile, more of a stiff athlete? All these factors affect your ability to do different movements and your ability to improve different movements. So if you're chasing these ratios, you're potentially leaving a lot of gains on the table that could be made in your strengths, just chasing balance and ratios rather than absolute performance, which
Yeah.
for a strength athlete is what you want. So like, people become so beholden to these ratios that they lose sight of what they're actually training for. And he's training for a bigger total because he's a powerlifter. And, say you've got a really flat chest and really long arms, bench is probably never going to be your strong point. And just because the other lads are benching more than you, it doesn't mean it's the best use of your training time. If you've got those long arms, then maybe putting extra effort into your deadlift, you could add kilos to your total more effectively, even though it makes your ratio worse. And that's, I
Yeah.
think, one of my main points.
Yeah, I see that. It's just I then also then have to come back with the thought of recovery from a bench press will be a lot easier. So then the potential for revisiting it more, increasing the frequency in exposure to the movement, and then potential strength gains. If
Yep.
he's only benching, say, just over 100 kilos compared to squatting, say, 240, 250 and deadlifting the same, right? The
Yep.
recovery from those two lifts, programming them the same and keeping your training as per, squatting and benching, say, squatting and deadlifting twice a week, but then maybe increasing the benching to say 3 times a week, because that is a lower, it's a lower apple to reach, right? Because
Yep.
it's a lower number. So you should technically, yes, he might not be mechanically, but also he could have been, because he's shit at the bench, just always been, I can't bother with the bench press, just like me and pull-ups. Shit at pull-ups. So I'm just like, I could have got really good at pull-ups if I programmed them and nailed them.
Yeah.
So, I can use the ratio of my body weight's too much for pull-ups, but again, that's a bullshit ratio, right? So for me, when I look at his performance, by increasing his bench press, for me, feels like an easier win than the squat and the deadlift, because he's been grafting away at the squat and the deadlifts anyway for years and been increasing steadily, which is the goal. So there's more room on the bench.
That could definitely be true. So I'm not saying this is definitely what he needs to do, but you could make the argument the other way around. If somebody's deadlift is way behind their squat and their bench press, you can't increase the frequency because deadlift is most taxing to the nervous system. So I think you're agreeing with what I'm saying in that it's multifactorial, right? So there's so many different things you need to factor into a program. The ratio is really low down the pecking order for what's most important. What's most important is the total. Then you have other considerations like injury history and recovery from certain movements and certain sessions. So all of those things for me trump the importance of the ratio. And I think having that ratio top of mind actually detracts from the potential results that people could be getting.
I get that, and I think where, to kind of bring this back a bit, I think what it does, I feel it gives people a standard, right? If people in their head say, right, if I can, and I know whenever anyone's asked me with like, what should I try and squat, bench, and deadlift? Like, what is a bare minimum? And I always say to them, aim for your body weight. That's across the board, because it's like, cool, you can lift your body weight off the floor, you can squat it, so you've got someone on your back, and you can press someone away if someone's fallen on top of you. Right, so those type of like fundamentals, I say body weight is the standard that we always aim for when you're aiming for a strength goal, which I know we're not discussing strength goals here, we're discussing obviously ratios. So, but what that then does, we're using a ratio to create a goal. Because I've said a 1-to-1 on your body weight to squat. So your body weight to then your squat weight should be the same. That's a first step in your strength journey. I guess when, for me personally, but then when we start going to other more arbitrary movements, say, that's where standards can become a little bit airy-fairy.
Yeah. So yeah, I think there's a good distinction between ratios and goals. What I'm absolutely not saying is it's bad to have a strength goal to get a certain movement up to a certain weight. I think that's great. Gives you a target, gives you something to work towards. But by focusing on the ratio and the relationship between different strength outputs, you're potentially leaving results on the table. Because say you're going 1 to 1 to 1, squat to bench to dead, you're going to get to the deadlift probably first, then squat, and then bench press. But if you get your deadlift to body weight, does that mean you should just chill out on the deadlift
No.
and wait until you get there with the bench? Exactly. So you, by having any ratio, you're not focusing on just progressively overloading the movements you want to get better at. And that's essentially it. Like we're overcomplicating something where if performance is the thing we're optimizing for, then just optimize for that. Don't optimize for relative performance
Yeah,
when absolute performance is what really matters.
I see that. I think coming from a more Gen Pop point of view, that would, if you've walked into the gym and you haven't had the opportunity to listen to this podcast, or if you haven't had the opportunity to have a coach,
I pity those people.
then it's like having someone might have arbitrarily said to you, aim for a body weight, bench, squat, deadlift. And then that's cool. And then as long as it's giving you then purpose, as you said, it's great to have the goal of that. I think bringing it back to then the ratio purpose, I think that's then where, if you then decided, like you said there, to stop training your deadlift because you hit your body weight, that's where things then go wrong, because the whole purpose of strength training is to progressively overload other people over a period of time. So I guess it's understanding and having a reality check on it and saying like, cool, what am I supposed to be going to? And I guess under having like we often say a lot of the time, is be clear on what your goal is. Exactly. Because that's going to have to be the real, if you're just going to the gym to start out your journey, the first thing is you need to start lifting. Doesn't matter what it is, you need to start moving. Then you might get into more the bench, squat, the deadlift and stuff, and you're thinking, cool, I'm now going to start aiming towards some bigger numbers. So let's start doing that. So it just gives purpose, I guess. So when I bring it there and say it does obviously depend, I guess we have to start thinking about, like you've mentioned there, about like your body proportions. That's obviously a massive indicator of, if you've got longer arms, you're going to be a stronger deadlifter. Yep. So, and it's something where when we look at these numbers on paper, we might not see that athlete had really strong arms. Really long arms. Oh. So yeah, so then if I'm trying to chase someone else who has a really good deadlift, I'm like, but he's already got a better advantage there. So I guess that is a really important thing to say when I would say comparing myself to other people in my weight category, looking at their bench performance, saying, cool, I need to improve my bench because I don't know what they have.
Yeah. I think that's it. Is that like the only thing that really matters is comparing you to your previous self. At the end of the day, to get better at anything, you've just got to be bettering yourself. So we always talk about comparing yourself to other athletes. For a general gym goer, that's not very productive. If you're a competitive athlete, then maybe you need to compare your strengths and weaknesses versus the field, because especially in a sport like CrossFit, that will ultimately determine your ranking, which is your score, which is your performance. So those are sort of nuanced caveats to this discussion. But if you just care about your performance, then just make sure the performance is going up. Don't care about the performance between different movements, which have different relationships with different people. So I think a good one to go into is in that weightlifting example where people say you should have a certain amount of clearance for your front squat over your clean. This can be wildly different for different athletes. I had a discussion with Chris Speed about this recently, and he talks about it really nicely, where essentially if somebody's really elastic and tends towards hypermobile, those numbers can actually be quite close because the speed of the clean gives them more stretch reflex. So they might actually be able to clean more than the front squat, or their numbers will be very, very close. Whereas if somebody's much slower, stiffer, then they probably need a bit more strength clearance. And you see these people who have really heavy front squats, but they can't clean it either because like technically the clean is lacking, or they just can't, they can't hit the positions at speed, or they don't have the flexibility to hit those positions at speed. There's lots of reasons why that might be. But if you're looking at somebody's performance profile and you see a front squat and a clean of a certain ratio, and you're chasing that ratio, where the thing that matters is their weightlifting performance. Like, what can they clean and jerk? That's what matters. And can we get that higher? And whatever we need to do to get that higher, we probably want the front squat to go up in all situations, really, unless it's a huge difference. And then we just work on clean technique. So the ratio is just a distraction from the reality. We want to focus on the actual goals for this athlete and and work on those. And I think the arbitrary ratios, like, it's all just information that can help paint a picture for what that person needs to work on, but it is not a goal in itself, which I think is my major frustration with it. It's like, oh, your ratio is slightly off, you need to add this into your program. I don't think you do. You just need to keep doing your program. You're leveling up across the board.
Yeah.
So why do you need to change what you're doing? Unless there's a sticking point or an issue or an injury or an actual imbalance, then look at it. But yeah, I think I've ranted enough on that one.
Yeah. No, but do you know what? It's funny because obviously, like, before we had this conversation anyway, like, I wasn't married to any ratios, but I have always thought in my head, I do think there should be a form of, for myself, a basis of where I want my performance to be, but that then leads it more into a goal rather than sticking to the ratio. So the fact that currently my bench press is lagging compared to my squat and my deadlift doesn't matter to me. Like, I'm not then, I need my bigger bench. I just want a bigger bench. I want a bigger squat and I want a bigger deadlift. So that's all of it. Okay. And the fact that my deadlift and my squat and my deadlift are getting closer together, I'm like, hang on a minute, what's going on here? And that could, my squat's just getting better. And that's exactly the thing. It's like, does that then mean I'm underperforming on my deadlift? Maybe. But also, it's a question for me that then it's more, as long as I understand what my numbers are telling me and I have a goal in place that's saying, cool, I want to progressively overload and just get stronger across the board. Like, as you said at the start, like with the total, or as I said, and you said, I said, the total is the goal. So to lift the most amount of weight in my category is the goal. However I get there is however I get there. I think the way, do you know, just having a little thing, I think it's more than like, not an egotistical thing, but I think of, I'm just good at everything. I think that's where the ratio then comes in. Yeah, I can bench, I can squat, and I can deadlift. It's not like, oh, I've got a really good deadlift, I've got shit everything else, but I've got a really good deadlift. So then I think it could be
a powerlifter. If you're a powerlifter, the ultimate bragging rights come from the biggest total, right?
Yeah, I know.
One lift.
It's just, it's interesting because I'm then thinking more, because I've never really put that much thought into why, like, these strength ratios, like, because I'm not married to them, as I said. I don't care too much about them, but they give an understanding to me of kind of where I want to be as a balanced athlete. I think for me is a nice just understanding. But is that then what determines what my programming is? No. Yeah. So it's just for me to be like, okay. I know
it's also not what determines your success in the sport, right?
Exactly. So I know
there's no points for being balanced. Like, you could have a 30 kilo bench, a 40 kilo squat, and a 50 kilo deadlift. But I know that's a perfect ratio, but it's not going to get you very far. Still shit. 100 kilo body weight.
So, well, I guess, exactly. So I guess that's what what you're saying there is about performing and improving on what you actually want to be performing and getting better at, rather than necessarily worrying about what other people say you should be better at. So it's taking more of an internal look at things and not saying, oh, Steve from the gym says I need to do this. It's like, no, you just get stronger across the board.
Exactly. Is your actual performance that matters improving? Is your movement quality good? So those issues like quad dominance and hip dominance, they're only a problem if they're a problem. So, like, having the ratio isn't the problem. The actual movement pattern itself might be a problem. So that's the point at which you need to look at that. But as we said before, there's plenty of examples of people who are quad dominant, who've got great deadlifts, and hip dominant, who've got great squats.
Well, look at strongmen. Strongmen are very, very quad dominant with how they deadlift. Most of them are also because they're massive machines, so they
Yeah,
kind of have to be. So I want you to kind of say your analogy about the supermarket thing, because I really like
yeah.
that. I thought it was cool. So can you say that?
Sure. Yeah. So I think optimizing for a ratio between movements rather than out overall performance. The analogy I like for this is if you are running a supermarket and you sell food and clothes, optimizing for a ratio is trying to get a nice balance between clothes sales and food sales when actually what you care about is total revenue. So if one of them was lagging, you wouldn't try to get them more even. You try to fix the one that's lagging. Like, why aren't you selling enough clothes? What do we need to do with the way that we sell clothes? You're not going to rein in food sales to optimize the balance. So I think the same goes for strength ratios. Like, if one of your movements is poor, it's poor because it's poor. It's not poor because of how it relates to something else.
Yeah.
The thing that you're trying to focus on is the big picture, actual bottom line, not how the intricacies of performance link together. And there might be a clue. They might have some overlap, but it isn't the goal in itself to just have an even. Like, if Marks and Spencers sold 50% clothes and 50% food, but they brought in £10 a month, that's not that's not a good state of affairs. If they brought in £1 million a month for a small shop and it was 90% food, they don't care. Like, at the end of the day, the business performance is what you care about, the overall output. And I think that's how we should view our athletic performance as well.
So I guess the main caveat, though, as we've alluded to, is CrossFit, right? Because you need to be a jack of all trades. So you kind of need to make sure you haven't got any glaring weaknesses, which are going to then penalize you later on in a competition.
Yeah, exactly. So in that resource allocation question, if you've only got so much training time or recovery capacity in a week, you need to allocate it in a way that maximizes for your position on the leaderboard in a CrossFit competition. So in that case, if you do have a glaring weakness, then there is a business case to spend more time and energy leveling it up. But that's because it has an outcome, has an effect on the eventual outcome of the leaderboard, not because your gymnastics is X percent of your powerlifting or is Y percent of your cardiovascular output. So that's an important caveat, because there is a situation where it should affect the balance of your programming, but it still doesn't really come back to ratios. It just comes to strengths and weaknesses relating to sporting performance.
So I guess overall, forget all these numbers, get stronger, make sure you move well. You're sweet, right?
That's it.
That's
all it is.
There you go. Simple stuff, guys. So we hope you enjoyed today's discussion. I did. I really did, because it kind of brought, as I mentioned it kind of brought a bit of a thought process to something that's always kind of been in the back of my head. It's never been a focus, but it's always been there. And it's always been, like when you said it earlier to me, a bit more like bro logic that's kind of stuck around for quite a long time. And where, come from a very bro background and enjoy that bro lifestyle, that it just hasn't disappeared. And it's just funny because as soon as you challenge it, you're like, actually, yeah. I think it's the challenge in these questions or these thought processes that kind of help you gain a better understanding of everything. And I think that's what I hope today's discussion did for you. So thank you very much, as always. We really do appreciate your time. And if you did have any feedback, or if you've got any, say, discussions based on this ratio talk, then we'd love to hear it. But as always, you can head over to Instagram, find us at lunge.lift, or you can just drop us a message and we'll be sure to get back to you. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys.